Chapter 4, Contextualizing the Virtual Reality World Projection Theory. 4.1, The fusion with transcendent physics and domain of the gods. A more speculative line of thought in recent decades has been the virtual reality world projection theory, often associated with what some call the domain physics school or storage school. Proponents of this view argue that the creative force behind civilization may be akin to a higher dimensional program or storage system, from which the necessary cultural and technological data is projected into our world. According to this hypothesis, the sudden emergence of Sumerian civilization with its sophisticated administrative, religious, and technological systems could be interpreted as a deliberate projection of a higher-level program intended to accelerate human development. Once this projected phase was completed, the data was recalled or terminated, explaining the disappearance of the Sumerian civilization from historical records. 4.2, Affinity with the biblical tradition, a flood reset meta-interpretation. If an actual catastrophic flood occurred in ancient Mesopotamia, it might be understood within the virtual reality framework as a reset event, programmed by higher forces. In Sumerian myth, Enki's intervention in the flood narrative, in which he warns Ziusudra or Atrahasis through a barrier of reeds, can be seen as analogous to the biblical command to Noah to build an ark. This parallel supports the idea that the Sumerian flood myth, and by extension, the Noah narrative, are not merely mythological recollections, but could represent deliberate interventions by a higher dimensional creator, seeking to regulate or reboot human civilization. The metaphor of a flood reset fits well with the notion that our historical reality may be a constructed simulation, where periodic resets are necessary to correct anomalies. 4.3, The challenge of distinguishing fact from speculation. While the virtual reality hypothesis provides a tantalizing framework to interpret ancient mysteries, it remains highly speculative from the standpoint of conventional historical research. The suggestion that Sumerian civilization was a projected phenomenon of a higher dimensional system, and that its myths and traditions, especially those concerning the flood, are embedded with clues to this underlying reality, is an intriguing but unproven idea. Nevertheless, the compelling parallels between Sumerian narratives and later biblical traditions have encouraged many scholars and enthusiasts of comparative mythology to explore these connections further. In particular, the identification of Ziusudra or Atrahasis as the prototype for Noah has found widespread support among comparative mythologists, lending credence to the view that ancient flood myths have a common origin, even if their precise nature remains elusive. Chapter 5, The quest for immortality and the reality of the flood myth. 5.1, The immortality plant as the archetype of the tree of life. One of the most famous motifs in the Epic of Gilgamesh is the quest for the plant that grants immortality. In the epic, Gilgamesh ultimately obtains this plant of eternal youth, only to have it stolen by a serpent. This narrative, tragic in its design, underscores the theme that immortality is beyond the reach of mortals. The motif of the immortality plant bears similarities to other cultural symbols, such as the tree of life found in various traditions, suggesting a universal human fascination with eternal life. If the Sumerians indeed considered their land as potassium iodide Ngi, Giengi, which some have interpreted as the land of the master of reeds, then the symbolic connection between reeds, water, and the regenerative properties of nature becomes even more pronounced. 5.2, The historicity of the Great Flood. The possibility that the Mesopotamian flood actually occurred is taken seriously in academic circles. Archaeological excavations have uncovered sediment layers that some researchers interpret as evidence of a great flood around 3000 BCE. Although definitive proof remains elusive, the consistency of flood myths across Mesopotamia and the similarities between these myths and the biblical account of Noah suggest that a significant, if not cataclysmic, flood event may indeed have taken place. The narrative details, such as the construction of a massive ark and the release of birds to scout for dry land, are echoed in both traditions, reinforcing the notion that the flood myth is based on a real historical event that was subsequently mythologized. 5.3, Evaluating the high likelihood of historical reality. The epic narratives, including the records of King Gilgamesh and earlier flood heroes, contain elements that have been partially corroborated by archaeological findings. This lends credence to the hypothesis that while these stories have been embellished, they may have a basis in historical reality. If figures like Ziusudra or Atrahasis were actual historical persons whose experiences of a catastrophic flood were later mythologized, then the Sumerian flood myth may well be considered the prototype for the biblical Noah story. In this way, the attribution of an archetypal status to Ziusudra as the Noah of Sumer is not an exaggeration, but a plausible conclusion based on comparative mythology. Chapter 6: Sumerian Civilization in the Old Testament. Archetypes and Reflections. 6.1 The transmission of the flood myth to the Bible. The flood myth, which was widely shared in ancient Mesopotamia, appears to have been transmitted to the ancestors of the Hebrews, and subsequently incorporated into the Old Testament's account of Noah's flood, Genesis chapter 69. Not only do the overall structures of these narratives match, but specific elements such as the divine covenant established after the flood, and the idea of a selective preservation of humanity are strikingly similar. The detailed instructions for constructing an ark further strengthen the connection between the Sumerian and biblical traditions. It is thus widely believed that the Sumerian and Akkadian flood myths served as the foundation for the biblical narrative of Noah. 6.2 Enki and the Sumerians' self-designation. Among the deities worshipped by the Sumerians were Enlil, Enki, and Inanna Ishtar, with Enki occupying a particularly significant role as a creator and god of wisdom. Some scholars have proposed that the Sumerians' self-designation Giengi might be connected with the name Enki, given the phonetic similarity of the Enki element, although the precise translation of Giengi is still debated, with interpretations ranging from land of civilization to land of noble. Fact that the Sumerian homeland was characterized by marshy, reed-filled environments lends support to the land of reeds hypothesis, since archaeological evidence shows extensive use of reeds in construction and daily life. It is likely that the Sumerians held reeds in high regard, a fact that may also be symbolically linked to the veneration of Enki, the water and wisdom deity, who is often associated with flood myths and messages delivered through reed barriers. 6.3 The mysterious appearance and disappearance of Sumerian civilization. Archaeological records indicate that Sumerian civilization emerged suddenly, displaying an extraordinarily high level of cultural sophistication, only to gradually be assimilated by succeeding cultures such as the Babylonians and Akkadians. The abrupt rise and eventual disappearance of the Sumerians is one of history's enduring enigmas. It is as if they appeared on the historical stage in a burst of civilization and, having fulfilled their purpose, were systematically absorbed into later cultures. The fact that the mythological narratives, including the flood legend, have been transmitted through subsequent civilizations, including their influence on the Old Testament, is evidence of the profound impact of Sumerian culture on human religious and cultural memory.